Welcome back to Askewed Reviews. And since today is Friday the 13th and we are in the month of October, I've decided to go and do reviews for the entire Friday the 13th series. So we start off today with the 1980 film Friday the 13th. Here is your trivia question for today. What is the nickname for Camp Crystal Lake? The answer will be at the end of this video. Our film starts off at Camp Crystal Lake in 1958, as we witness two counselors that are trying to get a little frisky, but then are quickly found and murdered by some sort of maniac. We then jump ahead to 1979, where Camp Crystal Lake is about to reopen, and there's a bunch of counselors trying to work hard at fixing and painting and making everything look good for the new season. Now, of course, when you work hard, you also have to play hard, which, of course, for these 18 to 20 something year olds means drinking and premarital sex, which is a lovely combination for a slasher film. So now, just like in 1958, a maniac is on the rampage running around and taking out each of these counselors. So, will this group of friends be able to figure out who's doing this and, more importantly, how to stop them? This movie was directed by Sean S. Cunningham. Cunningham actually wanted his own son to play the young version of Jason, but his wife wouldn't allow it. Victor Miller was the writer for this film, and he says that he got the name Voorhees as a last name of one of the girls he went to school with. By the way, if you didn't know, Mrs. Voorhees does not actually have the first name Pamela until the fourth film, where they actually show it on a gravestone. Sean S. Cunningham and Victor Miller actually met in 1977 while working on the film Here Come the Tigers, which was a complete ripoff of the movie The Bad News Bears. It's funny how ripping something off is actually the secret to their success with this film, because they were definitely riding the coattails of the movies Halloween and Meatballs when they created this one. Also, Victor Miller has even admitted that he just inverted the same formula from Psycho. This time around, it's actually the mother that's crazy and the son who's no longer alive. Cunningham is actually the one who named the movie Friday the 13th. He immediately knew that name would actually pull people in. In fact, all of the early marketing only showed the words Friday the 13th crashing through glass and didn't give any information of what the movie was actually about. Tom Savini, who did the makeup and some of the special effects for the movie, was one of the first crew members brought on, mainly due to his work on Dawn of the Dead. Savini was the one who suggested using the same formula as Carrie and having the big jump scare at the end of the movie with Jason. He was also the one that actually shot the arrow that almost hit Brenda. The camp where they did all the filming for this movie was in New Jersey at a Boy Scout camp called Nobi Bosco, which is actually, to this day, still a functioning camp where they do have some memorabilia from the movie. The camp was actually closed during filming, so no one would actually be around, but musician Lou Reed actually owned a farm nearby and would every once in a while just show up and entertain the cast and crew with some songs. The majority of the locations used in the film were already there at the camp. The crew only had to build the bathroom set. However, very few of them realized that only one toilet actually worked. Eventually, the other toilets had to be cleaned out because people kept trying to use them. Tom Savini and his assistant Tasso Stavrakis were the only ones, along with a few brave souls, that were actually willing to stay at the camp overnight while filming was happening. The rest of the cast were put up in hotels. To keep them entertained, Savini actually had a Betamax VCR with him, but unfortunately he only had two tapes, Barbarella and Marathon Man, which they would just keep switching off which one they were watching each night. Savini says that to this day he can still recite both of those movies by heart. Betsy Palmer, who played Mrs. Voorhees, did an amazing job in my opinion, although she originally hated the film and only did it for the money because she was desperate to get a new car. Over the years, though, she has warmed up to the movie and even made appearances at conventions and in documentaries. It's interesting that Jason, of course, became the main villain for this movie series, but they originally did not have any plans on Jason even being a part of the movie or the movie series. What's interesting also is because of Mrs. Voorhees in the first one, this first film and the fifth one are the only movies where Jason is not actually the killer. There also were other actresses that almost got the role of Mrs. Voorhees, including Estelle Parsons, Shelley Winters, Louise Lasser, and Dorothy Malone. Up until the point that we actually see Mrs. Voorhees' face, every time that she's supposedly killing someone or is in one of the scenes, it was actually Tasso Stavrakis that was actually doing the performance. Adrienne King originally auditioned for the characters of Brenda, Marcy, and Annie, but when they heard her scream, they knew that she was going to be their final girl, Alice Hardy. Sally Field was also potentially up for the role of Alice. The character of Bill is played by Harry Crosby, which, if you didn't know, is actually the son of Bing Crosby. This is one of Kevin Bacon's earliest film roles, and it's also one of the numerous movies where Kevin Bacon plays a character named Jack. Laurie Bartram played the character of Brenda, but that role almost went to Penelope Milford. So when it comes to the body count for this film, it's technically 11, although sometimes people will say 12 because they're trying to include Jason, who was talked about as having drowned. And that body count of 11 includes 9 counselors, 1 serial killer, and unfortunately 1 snake. You have Barry, who is stabbed in the gut with a hunting knife, Claudette, who had her throat slit by a machete, Annie, who had her throat slit by a hunting knife, Ned, who had his throat slit by a hunting knife, Jack, who was stabbed with an arrow through the throat, Marcy, who got an axe to the face, Brenda, who was shot with a bunch of arrows, and if that wasn't enough, her body was thrown through a window and it was tied up and really badly beaten, I'm assuming. There was Steve, who was stabbed in the chest by a hunting knife, Bill, who was shot with multiple arrows and also got his throat slit. There's Mrs. Voorhees, who was decapitated by a machete, and a snake who had its head cut off. Also, speaking of that snake, the whole situation with that was really messed up. Apparently, Tom Savini asked this guy who had a snake if they could use it for the scene. Well, apparently he didn't tell him ahead of time that they were actually going to kill the snake. So that was actually the snake's head being cut off, as PETA was not really on movie sets in this day and age, and apparently the actual animal owner was absolutely pissed. He was screaming and throwing a fit, and understandably so. So in case you were wondering where the famous ch actually comes from, it's actually taking the words kill and mom, so it's mom, mom, mom. And what they did is they kind of blended it together, as this is supposed to show Mrs. Voorhees going through her schizophrenic state as she is saying, "Get her, mommy, kill her." So when it comes to the film Friday the 13th, I really did enjoy this movie. Understandably, it really is a Halloween knockoff, but it's also a quintessential slasher film from the 80s, in my opinion. So I'm going to give this one a 5 out of 5. Now, if you can't get enough of Friday the 13th, there's obviously the multiple movies that came after this one. There is a TV series, but it has absolutely nothing to do with the movie series. They just wanted to use the name. There, of course, has been talks for multiple years now that they're going to make yet another remake of this. We'll see if that happens, although it should probably happen in the next year or so. There is actually going to be a prequel TV series on Peacock called Crystal Lake. There's also multiple comic books. There are actually 2 video games you can play, one for the original NES, which was not very good at all, and a newer one that is pretty fun actually, and a lot like Dead by Daylight. Also, if you really want to play as Jason, he has appeared in the Mortal Kombat series, so you can play as him as one of the fighters. There have also been a few board games, and if you want any movie recommendations, if you liked this film, I would of course recommend both of the series, Halloween and A Nightmare on Elm Street. Now, as for the trivia question from the beginning of this episode, what is the nickname for Camp Crystal Lake? The nickname for Camp Crystal Lake is Camp Blood, due to the murders of the 2 counselors back in '58 that were unsolved. Also, when speaking of Camp Blood, the original working title for this movie was in fact A Long Night at Camp Blood. I don't know if it would have done as well if it had that title, but it definitely sounds like an 80s horror film. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Askewed Reviews, and if there's a movie you'd like to see get a review, just mention it in the comments. Kill, 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 kill. Mom, mom, mom.